The terror attack on this mosque was the deadliest in Egypt's modern history. And eyewitnesses say the attackers carried Daesh flags.
They entered the mosque from outside, almost 10 to 20 people with weapons, and they destroyed everything. Some were wounded, but those killed were much more.
Most of the worshippers at the mosque in Bir al-Raid were Sufi Muslims. It's a branch of Islam that emphasizes benevolence, tolerance and self-control, and is seen as deviant by Daesh. Locals say the group had been threatening to attack the mosque and other Islamic celebrations held here.
The mosque of the Ahmadiyya Jaririya Sufi branch, there are celebrations for the Prophet's Mawlid on the square. We were going to celebrate the Mawlid soon. It's supposed to be next Thursday. The attackers don't want us to do this, so that's what happened.
The attack took place in a small town in the north of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. That's where one of the newest and most powerful branches of Daesh operates. It emerged in 2011 as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, known as Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis. It then broke away from Al-Qaeda and allied itself to Daesh. It now calls itself Daesh in the Sinai and has continued to attack security forces, and recently widened its crosshairs to target minorities and other Muslims. The attack has also raised questions about the efficiency of the security operation that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has used to justify his crackdown on political dissent within Egypt. Sisi assumed power in 2014 after overthrowing the elected president Mohamed Morsi in 2013. That followed weeks of protests and violence, something Sisi met head-on with force. He's since used the same rhetoric in the aftermath of each such challenge, including the latest.
من كل المصريين لازم تكونوا متأكدين وواثقين في ان المعركة اللي انتوا تخوضوها هي أنبل وأشرف معركة على الإطلاق في مواجهة الشر وأهله، في مواجهة الأعمال الخسيسة، في مواجهة ترويع الآمنين، في مواجهة القتلة، وهنشوف.
The speech was synchronized with air raids involving these Egyptian attack aircraft. The target was said to be Daesh camps and militants across northern Sinai. It's a tried and tested tactic, but one that appears to have had little effect on Daesh in the Sinai. And after this latest show of force, it's still unclear whether military might alone will be enough to end the threat. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from London by Ghanim Nusayba. He's the founder of Cornerstone Global Associates, a consulting firm that specializes in the Middle East. In Berlin, we have Ayman Tamimi. He is a research fellow at the Middle East Forum. And completing our panel from San Francisco is Giorgio Cafiero. He's the founder and CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consulting firm. Thanks, all of you, for joining us. Giorgio, let me begin with you. This was a terrible, terrible attack. Was it an intelligence failure, or in general, is Egypt just generally unable to stop this kind of attack?
To be clear, for many years, terrorism and unrest in the Sinai has been a major problem for the Egyptian state. This was the case not only for Sisi, but also in Morsi and Mubarak, were Egypt's leaders. Nonetheless, this attack on Friday in the northern Sinai showed the extent to which years of the Egyptian state's efforts to defeat the forces of terrorism in the Sinai have not proven successful so far. At this point, with the Islamic State losing substantial ground in the Levant, in Iraq and Syria, there is legitimate reason to be very concerned about more of these foreign fighters coming into the Sinai and exacerbating this threat in the future.
Right, and we're going to, sort of broaden it out into what Daesh wants and what ISIS might be doing as they've lost territory in Iraq and Syria, as you mentioned. We'll do that in a few minutes' time. But for the moment, Ghanim, let's look at what Sisi has done in response. He's fired a presidential advisor. He's promised brutal force. He's bombed we say alleged Daesh hideouts. Is that the right way to go? Is he doing the right thing?
Well, it is the right way to respond to militants. You respond to militants by fighting them. Obviously, this is a much bigger problem than a militant Islamist problem. Daesh is a manifestation on a wider continuum of Islamism that has been brewing for decades, years and decades. And fighting someone who walks into a room with a suicide bomb is the only way to deal with him or her. And so part of fighting extremism will have to be a brute military force, but fighting the longer, so the other parts of the continuum, the earlier parts of the continuum, through education, through development, through empowerment of the citizen, of the average person, is also part of the solution to a long-term problem. And I think this is what the current Egyptian government is doing at the moment. So it is part of a longer, much bigger package that has to deal with a very, very complicated problem.
Okay, so let's ask Ayman Tamimi. We've seen brutal force from the Egyptian state in the past. I mean, a few months ago, there was a video that came out that alleged that Egyptian soldiers were torturing and executing Daesh suspects. We've seen them, bomb militants in the Sinai before. So does it beg the question, this has been done before, we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't work because these guys are still capable of going into a mosque and blowing up 300 people and shooting dead those who escape?
Yes, that's very true. And I think the problem we have here is that many times before there's been this promise to inflict the decisive blow on the Islamic State militants in the Sinai, and then only for it really not to materialize. I mean, another example from earlier this year was the conflict that Islamic State got into with the Tarabin tribe in the Sinai, and there was talk of the possibility of inflicting a decisive blow on the Islamic State. Now, the Egyptian state would have tribal force on its side against the Islamic State in the Sinai, but that didn't materialize either. It does seem very much like the Egyptian state, the Egyptian military's tactics in the Sinai don't amount to effective counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty pessimistic.
Right.
I'm pretty pessimistic about prospects going forward.
Okay, Giorgio, let me ask you, the fact that they were more tasawwuf or Sufi oriented in Bir al-Abed at that particular mosque, is that a clear sign that they were targeted for the Sufi leanings? Or maybe does it have more to do with the fact that the Sawarka tribe was deemed as collaborators and seen as collaborating with the government? Are there more tribal elements or sectarian kind of theological elements here, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, according to my read, this is a mixture of both. As you said, the cooperation with the government seems to have been a factor. At the same time, we have known that these extremists have held certain intolerant views of Muslims, including Sufis, who are different. So without a doubt, there was an ideological motivation. This was a very big deal that they chose this target. I think this is largely to show the same time that the Egyptian state lacks authority over the Sinai. It's not to say that Islamic State has necessarily created the state apparatus in the Sinai that we saw a few years ago in Raqqa and Mosul, but I think the objective is also to demonstrate, as I said, that the Egyptian authorities have failed to assert their authority over the rest of Sinai.
Ghanim, to what do you attribute that? So Giorgio says that the Egyptian state has failed to assert its authority in the Sinai. What's behind that? Why hasn't it been able to do so?
Well, it's as I said, it's a continuum that reaches its apex with when you have someone blowing themselves up, and this is the problem with Islamism, looking at life with a monopoly of truth. So whether it's social, political, or militant Islamists, when they have this monopolizing of truth, of rejecting the other, whether they're non-Arab or whether they're Shia or whether they're Sufis, as we have seen in the past few days. And the problem here is that it's a very complicated problem that has been brewing for many, many years and many decades, and therefore has to be resolved through a multitude of solutions rather than one single solution. At the moment, it is absolutely true that the Egyptian state is facing difficulties, but a military difficulty that it is dealing with. Now, it would be wrong to say that the solution the military solution has failed. We're talking about a military solution for a military problem. There is a much bigger solution for a much bigger problem, and it will take a much longer time to develop that through participation, through a secular state, and secular not in the atheist sense of the word, but a secular state in the sense that we have a religion which is elevated to a layer a level higher than politics. That will take a lot of education that sadly is lacking not only in Egypt but in the rest of the Arab world and the wider Middle East.
Giorgio, Daesh, or attacks attributed to Daesh, or those that they've taken credit for, have happened in Egypt, in the cities, in the rural areas, in places like Cairo, Alexandria, in Sinai, as we're talking about now. Copts have been targeted, Shias have been targeted, Sufis have been targeted, foreigners, and so on. Does the Egyptian state have to distinguish between the attacks in the urban centers, like Cairo and Alexandria, and the attacks that are happening in Sinai, given that Daesh seems to be gaining ground in Sinai? Do they have to make a distinction?
Well, I think from a political point of view, the attacks unleashed in Cairo or other parts of mainland Egypt are more costly for the Egyptian leadership. I think many Egyptians who are living in Cairo and other major cities of the country are obviously very, very concerned about what's going on in Sinai. But at the same time, as we have mentioned, there is a long history of terrorism in the Sinai. The event on Friday, although much more deadly than past attacks, was not unprecedented in terms of just being an attack in the Sinai.
Okay, so Ayman, we look at it ideologically. Clearly, these guys pledge allegiance to Daesh. Operationally, how would this go down? Would they do the attack in Sinai on their own accord? Would they do it, without actually having to ask for permission from Abu Bakr Baghdadi or anybody else in Raqqa or wherever they may be? Would they do it? And then will it be celebrated afterwards? Or is there still some operational connection that stitches these people together?
In terms of the relation between what you'd call, Sinai is declared to be a province of the Islamic State. And in terms of the relations between provinces outside of Iraq and Syria and the center, there is something in the Islamic State bureaucracy called the Administration of Distant Provinces that's meant to manage relations between the center and the provinces. So, for example, if you're saying who appoints the overall leader of the Sinai province for the Islamic State, then this is something done by central decision. On the other hand, in terms of daily operations and even say big-scale ones, I doubt that there's a coordination in the sense that the central gives the go-ahead for a particular assault. I think the decision in that case has to be made on the ground, but I think when you think about the ideological contours of what those operations are, so for example, the targeting of Sufis, then that is something obviously the central IS Central approves of it. But in this particular case, though, they didn't even claim credit for the operation, and it's notable that there was even because of the scale of the killing, probably there was even some backlash in pro-Islamic State circles, like on the closed forums, such as Shumuq al-Islam. So I think that might be why the attack hasn't been claimed until now. Maybe just the scale of the killing and the fact that it can't be framed in the simple sectarian terms in the way that when, say, Islamic State attacks Shia or attacks Christians in Egypt. This kind of attack can't quite be framed in the same way, I guess, because Sufis, they're still, these Sufis, they're still Sunnis at the end of the day. They fall in that broad rigor.
Yeah, that's really useful. It's really good to learn that. That's very interesting that they are divided. Among their fans, I guess, online. Ghanem, are you terrified that the consensus seems to be, as was mentioned earlier in the program, the consensus by everybody who knows a thing or two looking at this thing is that when Daesh loses ground in Iraq and Syria, as they have lost ground, and they've basically lost all their ground there, the more they will lash out in towns and cities elsewhere, but more than that, they will strengthen their franchises or their provinces, such as Sinai and Libya. So if you're a Libyan or you're an Egyptian, you have to brace yourself for some terrifying times ahead. Are you terrified?
Well, I mean, it depends how we look at Daesh. Daesh, I think we should not look at Daesh as a cause, but rather than look at it as a symptom. It's a symptom. Treating the symptom does not treat the cause. If Daesh goes, there'll be other Daeshes coming afterwards. There'll be Daesh 2 and Daesh 3. Obviously, when Daesh is defeated, and hopefully this will be soon, they will try to fight back. And those who sympathize with it, and if the organization Daesh, and there is no such an organization in the sense that we understand an organization called Daesh, they would find another militant or extremist Islamist home to wreak havoc around the world. And so this is hopefully we're winning the war, the military war, the war against the militants, Islamic militants, but that should not stop us from the other part of the continuum, which if we don't address that, then we will have Daesh 2, 3, 4, until we defeat the much wider problem, and not only defeat it, but get greater engagement from the areas where Daesh has been able to recruit people, whether it's in Iraq, in Syria, or in Sinai and Libya and other places around the world.
Yeah. Giorgio, if the presidential team in Egypt called you in and said, hey, come and sit at the table and give us some advice, what do we do? How can we stop this? What would you say?
I would encourage the Egyptian authorities to view this problem not only as one which requires a military solution, but as your guest mentioned, there are many root causes of the Islamic State crisis in Sinai. In this part of the country, there are issues of poverty, economic marginalization, high rates of illiteracy. There's a very complicated tribal network, and many of the Islamic State figures in Sinai are locals who come from tribes, and they have many of these grievances which Islamic State has absolutely exploited. So I have no doubt that the Egyptian authorities are very committed to fighting Islamic State in the Sinai, but my concern is that when you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I think there's a big risk that by trying to use more brute force in the Sinai to fight extremists, the conditions that created fertile ground for them in the first place could exacerbate in the future.
Ayman, what does this tell us about the elasticity of the organization, given that in the Sinai, you can have a lot of these people with very, I guess, hand-to-mouth sort of grievances. And then, on the other hand, globally, you could have, I don't know, a kid in Molenbeek who grows up in Belgium who wants to go and fight for Islamic State, and both of them would be generally a part of the same organization. Tell me what it means in this day and age. How do you fight an organization that can appeal to both a Bedouin kid and a kid growing up in Brussels?
I think the important thing is to always address your solutions on the case-by-case basis rather than coming up with one grand panacea. So I mean, in the case of the Sinai, for example, as the previous guest mentioned, there are these issues of underdevelopment and local grievances against the state that need to be addressed. And also, as one of the other guests mentioned, about this problem of ideology and a wider spectrum, for example, that say would condemn Sufi practices, shirk or polytheism, and also say anti-Christian bigotry. So, in short, there's no one simple solution. It has to be addressed on the local level and case-by-case basis.
Yeah, very finally, Ghanim, when people mention that this was Egypt's 9/11 and they see it as a watershed moment, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's not totally unexpected. We've had the bombings against the churches in the past few months, and this is not entirely unexpected. And sadly, I think we cannot rule out any future attacks. But this is a fight that the Egyptian state and Egypt is fighting, and let's hope there'll be more. There'll be less deaths as a result of that. And I think what needs to happen now is strengthening the notion of a nation state, where there is more talk of policy and less of politics, as Hassan bin Talal always says, and that would hopefully bring up the level of discussion into building an Egypt that includes an integral part being Sinai, where there is economic development, which is what the government of Egypt is currently doing. This will take not months, but it will take years, and we just need to be hopeful that there'll be less deaths as this process continues.
Yeah, painful time for many Egyptians, the families of the victims. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you, Ghanem Nusaybeh, Ayman Tamimi, and Giorgio Cafiero. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.